On a cold spring night in 1865, a wooden steamboat was pushing north up the Mississippi River, against one of the worst floods the valley had seen in years. Her decks were packed so tightly that the men on board could not lie down. Almost all of them were soldiers going home. They were Union prisoners of war. Days earlier, they had been starving inside Confederate prison camps. Now the war was over, they had been set free, and they were crowded onto this single boat because someone was being paid by the head to put them there. The boat was called the Sultana. She was rated to carry 376 passengers. On this night there were more than 2,000 people on board. At 2 o'clock in the morning, about 7 miles north of Memphis, 3 of her 4 boilers exploded. As many as 1,800 people died in the river that night. It remains the deadliest maritime disaster in the history of the United States. More people died on the Sultana than on the Titanic, and almost no newspaper in the country reported it. In our last 2 episodes, we told the story of the deadliest disaster at sea, and the deadliest in peacetime. Tonight is the deadliest in America. This is the story of why you have never heard of it. To understand the Sultana, you have to start not with the boat, but with the men on her deck. In the spring of 1865, the American Civil War was finally ending. Lee had surrendered at Appomattox on the 9th of April. 4 years of killing were grinding to a halt. Across the defeated South, the Confederate prison camps were emptying. Among the worst of them were 2 names that still carry weight in American memory: Cahaba in Alabama, and Andersonville in Georgia. Andersonville was the most notorious prison of the war. Built for 10,000 men, it had held more than 30,000. Nearly 13,000 prisoners died there, of starvation, dysentery, and exposure, in little over a year. The men who walked out of these camps in the spring of 1865 were skeletons. Some weighed less than 100 pounds. They had survived disease, starvation, and the slow cruelty of captivity. All they wanted now was to go home. They were gathered at a parole camp outside Vicksburg, Mississippi, waiting for transport north. Most of them were from Ohio, Indiana, Kentucky, Tennessee, and Michigan. They had been soldiers since they were boys. Many of them had not seen their families in 3 years. The United States government had a system for getting them home. The Army paid private steamboat companies to carry released prisoners up the river. The rate was $5 for every enlisted man, and $10 for every officer. It was a simple arrangement, and it contained, hidden inside it, the exact incentive that would kill them. Because if a boat captain could fill his decks with as many men as possible, every single body on board was money. The Sultana was a sidewheel steamboat, built in Cincinnati in 1863. She was 260 feet long, wooden, fast, and only 2 years old. She ran the route between St. Louis and New Orleans, carrying passengers and cargo. Her captain and part owner was a man named James Cass Mason. Mason was ambitious, in debt, and looking for a way to make his boat pay. A government contract to carry paroled prisoners north was exactly the kind of money he needed. The man in charge of awarding those contracts at Vicksburg was the chief quartermaster, a lieutenant colonel named Reuben Hatch. Hatch had a long history of corruption. He had been investigated for fraud earlier in the war and had escaped court-martial only through powerful political connections. According to the survivors' accounts, Hatch made Mason an offer. He would steer at least 1,000 prisoners onto the Sultana, guaranteeing Mason a large payment, in exchange for a private kickback into Hatch's own pocket. There were other steamboats at Vicksburg that week, perfectly able to share the load. One of them, the Pauline Carroll, was a clean, large boat sitting at the same landing. She would eventually steam north that week nearly empty. Instead, the order came down to load every available prisoner onto the Sultana. The men themselves were told only that they were finally going home, and that their boat had arrived. They were happy. They had no idea what was being decided over their heads. And so the entire parole camp, thousands of men, began moving toward a single boat that was already carrying paying passengers and cargo, and that was rated, by law, to hold 376 people. But there was a second problem with the Sultana that week, and it was hidden deep inside her hull. On the way up from New Orleans, her engineer had discovered a leak in one of the 4 large boilers that drove her paddle wheels. When she docked at Vicksburg, a local boilermaker was called to inspect it. He found a seam that was bulging outward, where the iron plate had grown thin and weak. The proper repair was to cut out the bad section and rivet in 2 new sheets of iron. That would take about 3 days. Captain Mason did not have 3 days. The prisoners were waiting, the other boats were a threat, and his contract was slipping away by the hour. He pressed the boilermaker to do something faster. So instead of replacing the weak iron, the boilermaker simply hammered a thin metal patch over the bulge and riveted it down. It was a temporary fix, the kind you do to limp a boat to the next major repair yard. It was never meant to hold under a hard, sustained head of steam. To understand why this mattered, you have to understand the Sultana's boilers. They were long iron cylinders laid side by side, filled with water, with fireboxes beneath them. They were also interconnected, which meant water could shift between them as the boat moved. On a flat, calm river, that was manageable. On a flooded river, with a top-heavy boat rolling from side to side, it was a hidden danger. Water would slush away from the hottest iron, leave it exposed to the fire, and let it overheat. The patch sat right in the middle of that risk. The loading at Vicksburg took most of a day. The men came aboard in a slow, endless column, climbing the gangplanks and spreading out across every deck. They filled the cabins. They filled the corridors. They filled the open hurricane deck on top. As more and more men crowded onto the upper decks, the boat became dangerously top-heavy. Her own officers grew worried that the hurricane deck might collapse, and had timbers brought up to prop it from below like the supports in mine. By the time the loading was finished, the most careful laid accounts put more than 2,100 people on board. Some estimates run as high as 2,400, on a boat legally rated for 376. The men were so tightly packed that there was no room to lie down. They stood, or sat with their knees against their chests, shoulder to shoulder, for hour after hour. And almost none of them complained. After Andersonville, a crowded deck in the open air felt like freedom. On the 26th of April, the Sultana stopped at Hastily, Arkansas. A photographer on the bank set up his camera to capture the famous overloaded boat. When the men saw the lens, they all surged to one side of the decks to be in the picture, and the boat listed so far that she nearly capsized at the dock. That photograph still exists. It is the last image of the Sultana, her decks a solid black mass of men, packed rail to rail, every one of them looking at the camera. Within 36 hours, most of the people in that photograph would be dead. That evening, the Sultana reached Memphis. She unloaded some cargo, took on coal, and pushed back out into the river around midnight, fighting hard against a spring current swollen miles wide by the flood. Her 4 boilers were working at full pressure. The patch was holding. For now. By 2 o'clock in the morning on the 27th of April, the Sultana was about 7 miles above Memphis. Most of the men were asleep, packed together for warmth in the cold spring air. The boat was rounding a bend against the current, rolling gently from side to side. And in that rolling, the water inside the boilers shifted away from the overheated iron, then rushed back against it. Superheated metal flashed the returning water instantly into steam. The pressure had nowhere to go. 3 of the 4 boilers exploded at once. The blast tore straight up through the center of the boat, through the decks where the men were sleeping, and turned the middle of the Sultana into a fountain of fire, scalding steam, and splintered wood. Hundreds of men were killed in that first instant. Many more were thrown high into the air and came down in the freezing river. The 2 tall smokestacks toppled. The pilot house was gone. The center of the boat simply ceased to exist. And then the wooden boat, packed with bedding and timber and coal, caught fire. The survivors of the blast now faced a single, terrible choice in the dark. Stay on a burning boat, or jump into a flooded, ice-cold river in the middle of the night. The flame spread toward the front and back of the boat, pushing the living ahead of them. Men crowded onto the bow and the stern. Some tore off doors and shutters to use as rafts. Some froze where they stood, unable to swim, watching the fire come closer. One survivor, a private from Ohio, later wrote that the screaming of the men trapped in the burning wreck was a sound he could never describe and never forgot. He said the river around the boat was so full of people that, for a moment, it looked as though you could walk across it. These were men who had already survived the worst that the war could do to them. They had survived Andersonville. They had survived Cahaba. They had survived the surrender and the long wait for a boat home. And now, within sight of the journey's end, the river was taking them. The Mississippi that night was not the calm river of summer. The spring flood had pushed it miles beyond its banks, into the flooded forests on either side. The water was cold enough to kill, and the current was strong enough to carry a weakened man far into the dark before he could reach anything solid. And these men were not strong. Many of them had walked out of prison camp weighing less than they had since childhood. They had no fat to hold off the cold, and little muscle to fight the current. Some clung to debris until their hands simply stopped working, and then they slipped under. Men grabbed at anything that floated. Planks, barrels, dead horses, parts of the shattered deck. They grabbed at each other, and pulled each other under, dozens at a time, in the way that drowning men do. The lucky ones found a piece of wreckage large enough to hold them and drifted down toward Memphis in the dark. One soldier survived in a way that became almost a legend afterward. The crew had kept a live alligator on board, in a heavy wooden crate. A private named Daniel Lujan Beale drove the animal off with a bayonet, threw the empty crate into the river, and used it as a float to carry himself all the way down to safety. Downstream at Memphis, people on the waterfront began to realize what had happened. Steamboats got up steam and turned north into the dark. Small boats put out from both banks. They began pulling men out of the water, many of them naked, burned, and barely conscious from the cold. The rescue went on through the rest of the night and into the morning. Survivors were pulled from the river, from sandbars, and from the tops of half-drowned trees in the flooded forest, where the current had carried them and where they had clung on until dawn. The wreck of the Sultana burned down to the waterline and sank near the Arkansas shore. Of the more than 2,000 people who had been on board, only about 700 or 800 survived. And some of those died in the following days, in the hospitals of Memphis, from burns and exposure they could not recover from. The exact number of dead will never be known. The official Army count was around 1,200. The United States Customs Service put it at over 1,500. Most modern historians estimate that as many as 1,800 people died. Whatever the true figure, it was more than the Titanic, nearly half a century before her. A disaster of this size, in any ordinary week, would have filled the front page of every newspaper in the United States for a month. The Sultana did not. To understand why, you have to look at the calendar of that exact spring. On the 14th of April, less than 2 weeks earlier, President Abraham Lincoln had been shot at Ford's Theater. He died the next morning. The country was in the deepest national shock it had ever known, in the middle of mourning a murdered president. For 12 days after that, the entire nation followed a single story: the manhunt for the assassin, John Wilkes Booth. And on the 26th of April, Booth was finally cornered in a Virginia barn and shot dead. That was the night before the Sultana exploded. When the boilers blew, the newspapers were still full of Booth, of Lincoln's funeral train moving slowly across the country, and of the end of a war that had consumed the nation for 4 years. There was simply no room left in the public mind. 1,000 or more dead soldiers, on a river in the West, after the war was already won, could not compete with the death of the president and the death of his killer. The story ran for a day or two, and then it was gone. And there was something else. The men who died were not glamorous. They were not officers or society figures. They were poor farm boys from the Midwest, ex-prisoners, the most worn-down survivors of a long war, dying after the fighting was already over. There was no campaign, no battle, no enemy to blame. Just negligence, and bad luck, and greed. The Army did investigate. 3 separate inquiries were held. They found overcrowding, they found the rushed boiler patch, and they circled around the corruption of Reuben Hatch. But Hatch ignored his summons and was never tried. In the end, exactly 1 officer was court-martialed and convicted, and even that conviction was later overturned. No one was ever punished for the deaths of 1,800 men. Captain Mason, who had pushed for the rushed repair and the overloaded decks, did not survive to answer for any of it. He died with his boat, somewhere in the burning center of the Sultana, on the night his contract finally paid. The survivors did not forget. 4 decades afterward, the men who had lived held annual reunions, in Ohio and in Tennessee, growing fewer each year. At the last gathering, in 1930, a single old man came and sat alone. He died a few weeks before the next anniversary. The river, too, moved on, in the most literal way. Over the following century, the Mississippi shifted its course westward and left the wreck behind. Today the charred remains of the Sultana are believed to lie buried under a soybean field in Arkansas, about 2 miles from where the river now runs. There is no great national memorial. There is no Hollywood film. There is a small museum in a town in Arkansas, kept alive by descendants and a handful of local historians, and a scattering of stone markers in the towns the dead men came from. For the worst maritime disaster in American history, that is very nearly all. These were men who had survived the unsurvivable, and who died not in battle, but on the way home, because someone was paid by the head to crowd them onto a single boat with a cracked boiler. They do not need to be avenged. They only ask to be remembered. In the next episode, we will travel to another river, and another century, and to a ship that sank in full view of an entire nation watching live on television. Subscribe so you don't miss it.